This video instead is about my growing insanity, my growing spiral into Linux madness, my willingness to embrace the chaos that is the Linux environment, more specifically, Arch Linux. Oh, and did I mention, I use Arch by the way. In many of the most hardcore tech circles, you hear about Linux. You hear about how people love Linux. You hear about how people never want to go back to Windows. You hear about how Windows is spyware and somehow worse than Linux in almost every regard. And yet, not a lot of people use Linux. More people use Mac OS X than Linux, and you know how Windows dwarfs Mac OS X's market share. So you might be asking, what is Linux? Why do people care so much about Linux? What's the point anyways, right? And if it's truly free, as in freedom of speech as well as free as in it doesn't cost you a penny out of your wallet, why do people still use the most expensive operating system, Windows, which is like what, $100 per? Technically you can get it for free via other means, but I'm not going to cover those here. That's outside the scope of this video. So spoiler alert, the regular user interface, the user experience, is very, very usable, so long as your average user can read. So while I'm sure many people are willing to try Linux out just for the sake of it, I'm pretty sure most of you here are watching because, well, the Steam Deck uses Linux, the Steam Deck uses SteamOS, which is based on Arch Linux. I know that's the main reason I'm trying out Linux to begin with. And I mean, I have experience with Linux CLI. I mean, I do Linux stuff on servers. It's just that I've never used it as my daily driver because, well, the usability of it as a daily driver just wasn't up to where I needed it to be for my workflow. Nowadays, though, I use a lot of stuff that you could feasibly get on Linux, like DaVinci Resolve and GIMP and etc, etc. There's also the other elephant in the room, gaming. Linux gaming was always a thing, but it wasn't really a thing. Like 10 years ago, it was unthinkable to think that you could play like CS or Team Fortress or like any big PC game. And for what it's worth, things have gotten a lot better on the end. Let's start with gaming. So I do want to say that performance metrics are kind of out of the scope of this video because I'm here to talk about the experience of using Linux, not necessarily performance, so to speak. In terms of sheer feel alone, Steam games run somewhat similarly to how they would run on Windows on this machine via the Proton compatibility layer. That's the magic sauce that Valve is putting on your Steam Deck. I could benchmark it, I could give you exact numbers between both Windows and Linux on this machine, but that's beyond the scope of this video because I'm not here to focus on the frames, performance, or any of that, but Linux's viability as a daily driver. Generally speaking, games without anti-cheat will work with little issue, but even without anti-cheat, some weird games won't fully function, whether it's missing cutscenes or weird glitches. There's a little website here called ProtonDB. ProtonDB has a list of Steam games that, generally speaking, the community rates based on how well it runs on Linux via Proton. Now, sometimes there are native Linux games, and yes, they do sell native Linux games on Steam, and sometimes also show up too, but more often than not, it's going to be Windows titles running via Proton. As for the matter of non-Steam games, well, you'll really have to find out for yourself if they work, because it's not on ProtonDB. You can use Proton or the more standard Wine, which Wine I'll get into later. But honestly though, for the most part, I'm still trying to figure out how to run non-Steam games on Linux, so I'll report that back to you guys. So for Steam games, it's pretty freaking good. Just try out your games and see if it works. And on the subject of anti-cheat, the anti-cheat providers BattlEye and Easy Anti-Cheat have announced full Linux support and also Proton support. And so soon, it depends on the developers when they update their games, but soon, those games will be playable on Linux too. So stick around. So, what's the first thing that pops into your mind when you think of Linux? If you guessed the terminal or command line, congratulations, you win immense power and control. So there's this often cited meme that Linux users have to know command line and have to be super technical hackers in order to install programs such as a simple web browser. And while the Linux elite would like you to believe that, the truth of the matter is that's not always the case. Yeah, using command line is a lot easier and also a lot faster if you know what you're doing, but if you don't know what you're doing, there are other ways to install programs. As you can see here, I literally just downloaded DaVinci Resolve, or actually I'm in the process of downloading DaVinci Resolve on a Linux laptop, no less. So the download finished, and as you can see here, I'm just extracting the zip file as I would on Windows, except instead of a .exe file, it's a .run file, which I can guarantee you've never seen it in Windows, because I've never seen it in Windows, and I use Windows extensively every day. But as you can see, the program installation is literally as you would expect in Windows. A installer opens up and you follow the wizard. And look, it even comes with a little readme. Look, it doesn't look that different from Windows. Do keep in mind that programs you download from the developers' websites may not always have the dependencies that they need to fully run, as was the case with DaVinci Resolve. It's basically no different from like if you had a program that needed the redistributables from Microsoft. You have to download those separately. There's also the option to install programs from a graphical package manager. Some might call it an app store of sorts, which, I mean, isn't entirely wrong, but the Linux faithful will call you wrong for doing so. As you can see here, I was trying to download DaVinci Resolve from here as well when I already had it installed. So don't do that. Pick one source or another. All in all, it's very similar to how Windows has things set up nowadays. You have the Microsoft Store, the Microsoft App Store where you can get apps. You also have the internet, and you also have third-party repos such as Steam, where you can just download games from Steam. It's very similar, so there's no shortage of ways to install programs, with the added benefit of using command line, of course. So that about concludes part 1 of this adventure to test out Linux and see what it's all about, how it fares, etc., etc. And truth be told, that barely scratches the surface of what you can do with Linux. I didn't record this, but I also wrote the entire script of this video in LibreOffice, which is an Office replacement, which I'll get into next video, but not right now. There's also the matter of customization, which is a lot better here than it is on Windows. So if you're the kind of person that picks Android because you can customize the crap out of Android easily, I think you'll be more at home with Linux than you will be at Windows at some point. That said, I'm not comfortable making a hard recommendation to try Linux out or even switch to Linux or even reject Linux outright. Not till I have adequate time with it. That said, all of your skills here will transfer over in December when you get your Steam Deck. That is, if you guys are getting it. If you're not, then whatever, but I'm getting one. Till then, I'll see you guys next time.